So today we are going to talk about the Civil War. I am going to take a couple of these slides that are battle specific and convert them to a PDF and just post them as well because I don't want us to get in this conversation, I don't want us to get too bogged down in battle details. The slides themselves are pretty general about the battles. I'll leave that to you in your annotations and your textbook reading. The most important thing to know for the battles is, causes and consequences, and then general ideas of the strategy. So while the Civil War certainly looms large in American history, there's no denying that, the most important thing for us to understand are causes and consequences. So the build up to, the aftermath of, et cetera, et cetera. So with that in mind, this is a potential long essay question that I want us to think about how we would answer. Evaluate the extent the Civil War impacted the political, social, and economic landscape of the United States. So here we're talking about consequences of the Civil War. How did it change the political reality? How did it change the social and economic realities of the United States? All right, so let's start with secession. So Lincoln is going to be elected, and of course, that's like the immediate cause, right? After Lincoln is elected, many in the South call for secession. And they've tried that once before, with South Carolina leading the way, and South Carolina is going to be the one who leads the way this time as well. On December 20th of 1860, that's it, South Carolina is gone. Buchanan is still president. Remember, Lincoln is president-elect. So what does Buchanan do? Well, he says states can't secede, but if they do, the federal government is powerless to stop them. It's a really interesting sort of tactic to take, but also keep in mind that there have been such high and rising tensions for so long, and sort of at the 11th hour, there's usually some kind of compromise that staves off a really large-scale conflict. And so there is every indication that something will intervene here. At the same time, though, there is also every indication that this conflict is a long time in coming. So in February of 1861, newly seceded states who follow South Carolina are going to meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and they will create what they call the Confederate States of America. They begin to seize federal property. However, these forts, Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens, are going to be exceptions to that. Fort Sumter in particular, Buchanan refuses to give up. He's actually going to resupply or attempt to resupply that fort, but the Confederates block the resupply. So this is significant. This is a military confrontation now in the making, not just a political differences. So here is sort of the order. So in the green, you have free states and territories. In the yellow, you have border states. They are slave states, but they stay in the Union. They do not secede. The sort of light brown there, those are slave states that secede before the attack on Fort Sumter. And then in the blue, those are slave states that secede after the attack on Fort Sumter. And you can see the red is the border of the Confederacy. And then you also, in the Confederacy, see the date in which they secede. So it's pretty quick. South Carolina secedes in 1860. And look up there at Tennessee, June of 1861. So while there is some space, right, there's some gaps between when the states secede, it all still happens in pretty short order. Will there be a compromise? There's an attempt. John Crittenden of Kentucky is going to put forth what's known as the Crittenden Compromise. It would reestablish the Missouri Compromise line and extend it west. Southerners in the Senate are actually on board with this, but Republicans don't accept it because remember, think back to what Lincoln advocates for. He doesn't want slavery to spread south or spread west. That's the whole point of his position. So Republicans are not on board with this. Lincoln comes to office in March. That's going to prompt even more states to secede, reference back to that map with the dates. And Lincoln is going to wait for the Confederates to be the ones to attack Fort Sumter, and at that point, the Civil War will begin. So there needs to be a military provocation in his mind, and that is it. And then again, it lists other states who secede after the attack on Fort Sumter, and then slave states that become known as those border states. Here's another map for you. This is in relation to the Crittenden Plan, what the Crittenden Plan would have accomplished in the extension of the Missouri Compromise line. Who are the commanders that we're talking about? In the North, you have Winfield Scott. We've talked about him a lot. George McClellan, Ulysses S. Grant, future president, George Meade, Irvin McDowell, and William Tecumseh Sherman. In the South, you have Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, P.G.T. Beauregard, Sidney Johnston, and Joseph Johnston. There are some questions about whether or not Europe will choose a side. If you had to guess which side, if Europe was going to be supportive of one side, which side would it be? Well, there's an argument to be made most strongly, most people felt, for Europe supporting the South, because the South was agricultural and they were exporters, and so they exported their goods to Europe. Now, the North is also dependent on Europe. Remember, the North, they're manufacturers, they have some trade there as well, for sure, but the South is really going to have the strongest economic ties to Europe at this point. However, Europe does not end up supporting anyone. Also, and I didn't mention this a second ago, but there were people in the South who thought that Europe might take this as an opportunity to try to weaken the United States, because it divided United States in their mind was a weaker United States in terms of competition, economic competition. But there's really not a lot of popular support for the Confederacy and the ideals of the Confederacy in Europe. And by the end of the war, none of that support has materialized. The war is going to officially begin in 1861. You have the First Battle of Manassas at Bull Run, which was the first major battle. People actually came to watch this first battle. They thought that it was going to be sort of entertainment. It was so bloody, though, that the early battles of the Civil War are really a wake-up call to American citizens that this isn't going to be quick, that it's not going to be confined to, Virginia or something, right? That it's going to be widespread, that it's going to be bloody, that it's going to be devastating economically and also in terms of lives lost. So really quickly, people come to understand just how vicious the Civil War is going to be and how it's not going to be a quick sort of springtime distraction. Fighting out west. So this map gives us a good indication of where sort of the battles are concentrated. You can see Fredericksburg there. You can see Cedar Mountain, Yorktown, all of these states here, Antietam. And then you can also see in the very top right, that's Bull Run. And there's two different battles at Bull Run. And then you also see, if you look over towards Memphis, some battles there as well. You see Shiloh there. So the red lines are going to be Confederate troop movements. The red lines with the dashes are retreats. And then the red sort of starbursts are Confederate victories. The Union troop movements are in blue. The dashed lines are Union blockades of the South. That's important because the North was able to cut off Southern supply lines. And then the starbursts are Union victories. Now, this is a map, 1861 to 1862. So this is one of those slides that I was referring to where I don't want to read all of these things off to you. I'm going to turn some of them into PDFs. Hopefully they can help you better understand some of the battles. I don't want to get too bogged down in battle details. Antietam, know that Antietam is the bloodiest day of battle in U.S. history, where 22,717 are lost. It is a Union victory, and it's one of those battles that's considered a turning point. There's Antietam. Let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. In September of 1862, Lincoln announces he will use his war powers to free slaves in the Confederacy. Are all Republicans on board? Well, you have radical Republicans. They're led by people like Thaddeus Stevens, and that's Thaddeus Stevens, and also Charles Sumner of the caning of Charles Sumner fame. And radical Republicans want to use the war to abolish slavery. But there are also, and that's Charles Sumner, there are also conservative Republicans who want to adopt a policy that makes the border states happy. Because remember, the border states stayed in the Union, and conservative Republicans don't want to push border states to join the Confederacy. Also, a lot of conservative Republicans are members of border states. Okay, so you have, they would not want to free all the slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation will be issued on January 1st of 1863, and it's a bit of a compromise because the Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves in the Confederacy, which is really interesting. So what about the border states? Does it free slaves in the border states? No, it does not. What about the Confederate states under Union control? Does it free Confederate states, slaves in Confederate states under Union control? No, it does not. Okay, so in 1861, we also have the Confiscation Act, where all slaves used in rebellion are going to be considered free. In 1862, you have a second Confiscation Act, where all slaves whose owners supported rebellion are freed. And in 1862, you have slaves freed in D.C. and Western territories, with the government paying the owners for the loss of their slaves. So I'm not trying to downplay the Emancipation Proclamation, but know that it happens in a context, know that it was a compromise, and know that it doesn't free all of the slaves overnight. Slaves don't wake up the day after the Emancipation Proclamation and consider themselves to be free. There were other acts that maybe did more than the Emancipation Proclamation does, but what it does do is signal that the war will end slavery. There's some question to that. After the war is over, if the Union wins, will it just go back to how it was, where there was still tension over slaves versus free states? But no, the Emancipation Proclamation sends the signal that this war will be a referendum, so to speak, on slavery itself. More battles. 1863 is known as the Year of Decision. So this is the turning point year. This is when Vicksburg falls. This is when the Confederacy is split in half, where Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas are cut off. The Battle of Gettysburg happens in 1863. The closing battles of the Civil War are 1864. Let's see, what do I want to mention here? This is Sherman's March to the Sea, also the burning of Atlanta, which we know, I know we've heard of, having lived in the South, we've heard of that before. But it's most significant not just because Atlanta burns, but because supply lines are destroyed in the process. I'm going to play a short little video here.
From November 15th until December 21st, 1864, General William Sherman, Uncle Billy as his troops called him, marched more than 60,000 men, 285 miles, from Atlanta to the port city of Savannah, Georgia, during his famous March to the Sea. His soldiers burned buildings, twisted miles of railroad track, and trampled the countryside.
General Sherman realized and understood the importance of railroads in the American Civil War. He used them to his troops' advantage, and then he destroyed them. Typically, the destruction of rails by heating them under fires and then putting them around trees became known throughout the South as Sherman bow ties.
The Civil War started as a sort of quaint, almost genteel war where the fighting was really between the armies. By 1864, the war had completely changed. Civilians were now fair game, as Sherman proved as he moved through the South. He lived off the civilian population and land. He destroyed everything in his path.
On December 21st, 1864, Union soldiers arrived in Savannah, Georgia, to find the city abandoned. General Sherman presented the city and its 25,000 bales of cotton to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift.
William Tecumseh Sherman absolutely defines the Atlanta campaign, and he really defines the entire war in 1864. With that soaring northern morale, Lincoln is reelected, and once the political will is in place to prosecute the war to its conclusion, only then does the outcome of the war become inevitable.
Okay, so all that is going to lead us to the election of 1864, which will see Lincoln and his running mate, his future vice president, Andrew Johnson, who is a Democrat, but a war Democrat. He's anti-secession, although he's from Tennessee. It will see the Republicans versus Democrats, McClellan, a general who was a Union general. He wants a truce. He wants the war to be ended. So the election becomes, do we continue the war? Do we finish what we started? Or do we end the war now? Lincoln will win. The Republicans win, bolstered by a series of Union victories that tell the public that we're close to finishing this thing. Savannah surrenders on December 20th, 1864. In 1865, Grant captures the railroad junction south of Petersburg. Jefferson Davis, who is the president of the Confederacy, and his entire cabinet will flee to Richmond. Lee moves west, hoping to turn south, but he's blocked in, and Lee and Grant will meet in Appomattox, Virginia, where Lee will surrender on April 9th, 1865. Jefferson Davis will ultimately be captured in Georgia. There are a couple of really good slides here that are going to help you with precise information, and I think this number is really interesting. About 186,000 emancipated blacks fought for the Union, although they served in segregated regiments. Most were assigned tasks like digging trenches, etc. Black soldiers captured by Confederates were sent back to their masters or executed. So that is quite the risk that freed blacks were taking fighting for the Union. Women, just like in other wars that we'll talk about in the future in the United States, take over positions that had been vacated by men as they went to fight. You have people like Dorothea Dix serving as volunteers during the war in field hospitals, and by the end of the war, women are the dominant force in nursing, etc. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are also mentioned here, and there's more about them and that reformers work that we looked at. And then the economic and social effects of the war, all of this will come into play in our Reconstruction conversation. So talking about, are women suited for the public sphere or not? The war cut off Southern planters from producers from Northern markets, which is a really big deal, and it decimates the Southern economy. The Southern infrastructure is also decimated. Remember the burning of Atlanta and the destroying of the railroads. So during Reconstruction, the South is literally going to have to be reconstructed, its basic infrastructure as well as its political and economic systems. The war is over. Slavery is dead. America faces the question of Reconstruction.